Bilingualism and human rights. So, how is bilingualism related to language policy and how is it related to human rights? Now, language policy has been criticized for being elitist, that is, those who make the language policy, they construct a linguistic market in which the linguistic capital or the languages that they already know have a higher place or higher prestige. Now, when a language that you know has a high prestige, then it also means that you are able to access the resources within that country or that place without any obstruction. So, it has been argued that language policy is manipulated for self-serving interests of the elites, and you have several researchers, including Tollefson, Philipson, you have Skutnap Kankas who are talking about it at macro level, and there are people who talk about it at micro, that is individual level also. So when we come to language rights, the question is, why do we need language rights? There's reasons given for it. For instance, the first reason that is given is that we need to understand that this thing to use your own language has to be considered a right because one has to face up to linguistic imperialism. This is the phrase that is used by Philipson, and he argues that even now we are living in a state of imperialism and we are still colonized because the values of which we were subjected to earlier in terms of which languages are better, those values are still somehow very much there in terms of ideologies. So we need to also sort of stop the decline and loss of the world languages, because when a language is lost, with that language, the culture of that place is also lost, and you don't want people to shift away from their own cultures, but we need to respect their own cultures, their own languages, and development does not necessarily has to actually erase their own personal or communal spaces. So there is an argument that the historical, social, and political construction of certain languages which are called minoritized languages or minority languages also needs to be revisited. So no matter if the language is minority, and this reminds me to tell you, when we call something a minority, it does not have to do with numbers. You might call a language a minority language when the speakers of that languages might be more than those languages that you might call majority languages. So this is very interesting phenomenon because this is related to power. Then there is this question of language shift. At times when language policy supports certain languages at the expense of others, for instance in the workplace or in schools, then at home also the mothers and fathers stop speaking to their children in their own languages. They try to bring about a shift in language use so as the child might be able to participate in the education or the workplace. So we want to stop that shift, and we don't want someone to learn a dominant language at the expense of their L1. So we want to go towards the route of additive bilingualism, adding on a language in schools, and not subtractive bilingualism, that is allowing them to forget their own language and then learn the second language. So there is a need to restore the prestige of the minority languages. Skutnap Kangas and Philipson argue that language rights, as we speak of, are of two categories. They might be individual language rights and they might be communal language rights. Individual rights relates to a person's choice to use any language that he or she might know, and to be able to learn in that language, to be educated in that language. Community rights relate to collective action that can be performed within that language sphere. That is, they should be allowed to establish their own schools, have a say in the curriculum, and sort of make or create opportunities in which their language might be transmitted, disseminated, and respected. So, language rights, Kutnam Kangas goes on, is also of two categories. One is expressive or non-instrumental rights, and the other one is instrumental rights. What are expressive rights? Expressive rights mean being able to express yourself in a language of your choice. This is an expressive right. The other right is an instrumental right, that is being able to use the language that you know to access the resources you want to, and also to participate in whatever democratic processes that might be going on. Language rights have been explained in terms of three principles if these are to be integrated anywhere. The first thing is that it has to be promoted. So language rights, one part is that people should be allowed to promote their own language in such a way that if they know their language, they are able to access everything that is going on around them. Then it should also respect this territorial and personal rights. One has to keep in mind that within a specific territory, for instance, let's take the example of Quebec. If they want to use French as the language, then they should be allowed to use that language. And this is related also to the personal rights that we talked about. And then Skutnab Kangas says that if language rights are to be integrated in a country or in a language policy, then there have to be some traditional hard and soft rules and mechanisms in place that allow the implementation of those language policy aspects related to minority languages. For instance, or people who speak Seraiki or people who speak Punjabi, that should be also given some sort of like a weightage in the workplace. For instance, if you want to work in a far-off place in interior Sindh, then a person who is to be posted there at a higher job should be allowed to, or actually tested to, not just allowed to, know that language, Sindhi, so that person can actually communicate with the common people over there. So this is what we mean by traditional and soft laws.